Hey, all you cool cats and kittens. It's your favorite history teacher back at you again with another historical video. And today we're beginning period 3 coverage of information that happens between the years 1754 to 1800. So that includes the American Revolution, the foundation of America, Declaration of Independence, Articles of Confederation, then the United States Constitution. Come on now. How can I forget this? Bill of Rights, Anti-Federalist, Federalist. So it all begins in this period. So let's get into it. Let's take some notes. All right. So chapter 4 is called The Empire in Transition. So let's get into it. Like I said, important stuff. So loosening of ties. So you have this thing, salutary neglect, which is basically letting the British let the colonists kind of develop on their own, and they weren't really involved, right? So you have Prime Minister Robert Walpole did not strictly enforce the Navigation Acts. Remember, the Navigation Acts were supposed to be American colonists only trading with Britain. And remember how that led to smuggling? And many colonists saw each other as foreigners, you know, whether you're from Massachusetts to Georgia, North Carolina to New York. Okay. So there's this idea of, or lack thereof, of colonial unity. You have this Albany Congress, which came together to propose a formal treaty with the Iroquois nation because, you know, as colonists kept encroaching westward on Iroquois lands, you know, conflict over land. They want to make a treaty saying, okay, we won't go this far, blah, blah, blah. But the real Albany Plan, which was approved by delegates from each colony, however, they were rejected by some colonies, and you have Benjamin Franklin's join or die, join this intercolonial type of government. And this is like the first chance that America has to form as like a united front, maybe not necessarily against the British, but, you know, coming together as one, because like I said last year, and if you don't remember last year, these colonies, they have their own types of government, types of religion, types of industry, you know, whether it's manufacturing or, you know, agriculture, and they have their own types of currency. So it's very different. And Ben Franklin creates this join or die political cartoon, as you see here, where, you know, you're either going to join up or the colonies as themselves will be no more. All right. Okay, so the struggle for the continent, as we've come to know, the French and the English are going to compete for native loyalties. No, not colonists, even if they've been here since 1607, 1588, whichever way, the Native Americans, Native indigenous peoples of America were here first, obviously. And so the French and the English are going to compete. And the French were more tolerant as they traded with them. They intermarried with them. and they became like assimilated in French culture. And England, however, the harsh treatment, they still had more goods, and with the colonists encroaching upon more and more land, England had some desire for some native goods, and the natives had desire for weapons to defend themselves better, right? So you have something called the French and Indian War here on the North American continent. It's also called the 7 Years' War in Europe, and it was started by George Washington when he attacked Fort Necessity, which was near Fort Duquesne, and it was a French fort, and both the colonists and British fought the French. So, that's why it's the French and Indian War. So the French and the natives joined up together to fight the colonists and the British. And also the British had some natives on their side as well. Not too many, but, then you have like mercenary armies of French Indians versus French in the Indian tribes versus the British, the colonists, and some natives as well fighting each other. So I just said that. Colonists were not respected. There's a lack of promotions. Colonists could only be promoted so high within the British Army that they kind of felt discredited. Especially our boy George Washington. He can only go as high as, I don't want to say a general because I think the general is the highest type, but major, something like that. So you have the Peace of Paris ends both wars in 1763. Even though it's called the 7 Years' War in Europe, it was fought from 1754 to 1763, so that's 9 years. Can't do maths. And France, basically, with this treaty, is essentially removed from North America. And effects from the French and Indian War, F&I, French and Indian War. Britain is in loads of debt, and they need that money. Okay, so here's Fort Necessity, and here are pre-war boundaries. 1754, you have the colonies, you have the French in orange, and you have in northern Canada the British. And all this changes following the war. All that pink, British territory. All right, so new imperialism. So 1763 is a big year. Just note that a lot of things change in 1763. With that being the end of salutary neglect. Britain began taxing the colonies more and more efficiently. You have a new prime minister, George Grenville, and he felt that the colonists should help pay for the cost of war, that the British came and fought for them. So you can blame him for all the beginnings of the American Revolution, because that is kind of what stirs the pot. And then you have something called Pontiac's Rebellion. In 1763, there was conflict in the Northwest Territory on, the Northwest Territory is not the American Northwest as we know today. It is the regions of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin. That's the Northwest Territory to them. And with colonists encroaching on the territory, they finally said enough is enough. And so they want to have this proclamation line of 1763. And that's going to forbid the colonial expansion beyond the Appalachian Mountains. Big year. So this is out here in the Northwest Territories. You have George Grenville. Do whatever you want. That's salutary neglect. All right, so continuing on. So how do you get money? Well, you tax the people, right? So the first such taxes passed was 1764, the Sugar Act, which was a tax on sugar to reduce the illegal trade, and people will be sent to vice admiralty courts if you're caught smuggling. You have the Currency Act in 1764, where colonists could no longer use paper money. And just so you know, there wasn't that lot of gold and silver going around, so that's going to be disheartening. And you have obviously the the Stamp Act, and that was the one that kind of tipped the I want to say sales. I don't know why tipped the balances, because everything purchased, everything made in America, a transaction was on paper and it had to have a stamp. And so, that's everything that the colonists are doing are being taxed on. That, it's going to lead to some disruption and to some disgruntlement. And colonists were upset that this tax was passed without the consent of colonial assemblies. Remember, each colony has kind of got their own colonial legislature, and without them having a voice in Parliament back in England, they felt that that was unfair being passed on to them because they didn't get a say. Because obviously, they don't want to be taxed. So gold and silver, here's some sugar, and here's a stamp that is on one of those paper documents. Remember, it could be letters, receipts, marriage documents, licenses, anything that was written down on paper had to have a stamp. All right, so some stirrings of revolt, and so that leads to the Stamp Act Congress, so creatively named. And this is the first attempt at colonial unity against the British. Okay, remember that Albany plan kind of failed, right? So you have some things called the Patrick Henry and the Virginia Resolves. And Patrick Henry is going to believe that Americans should have the same rights as the English because they kind of are English descendants. So we should have the same rights as the English. And in the Virginia Resolves, Virginians should only pay taxes that were passed by the Virginia Assembly. Again, leading to that, we will pay our taxes that our state, our colony agrees to, and not leading to this, getting taxed by the English. Not going to happen. Then you have a man named James Otis, and he's going to call for an intercolonial Congress to take action against the stamp tax. And then you also have a group spurred on by James Otis, the Sons of Liberty, and they will terrorize the stamp tax collectors. And, here's some, tar and feather them in public. Here you have Patrick Henry, or I think that's the Stamp Act Congress. So some more stirrings of revolt. You have the Declaratory Act, which the British realized how upset the colonists were. So they repealed the Stamp Act, but they passed the Declaratory Act, which meant that Parliament could pass any laws whatsoever, regardless of colonists being English or not. So you have Charles Townshend, and he's the Chancellor of the Exchequer back in England, basically handing out all these taxes. So you have the Quartering Act of 1765, where colonists had to provide quarters, a room, and supplies for British troops in America. So if there was going to be a war fought, colonists would house soldiers. And this you see this a lot. In the TV show that was on TV, Turn, you kind of see this a lot in that TV show. It makes a representation. And that is why it is also the Third Amendment to the United States Constitution, because the colonists had to provide housing arrangements for these troops and not get paid for it. Right? That's not right. That's also going to lead up into the War of 1812, but more on that later. And you have the New York Assembly was disbanded because they were not complying to allow British troops, soldiers in their homes. So you have something called the Townshend duties or Townshend taxes. And that's going to lead a tax on imports like lead, paint, paper, and tea. All that tea, and not just the drama. So here you have a colonial woman, and she's talking to some British soldiers, and that's Charles Townsend, whichever way you want to say it. More stirrings. So you have non-importation agreements. So that's basically boycotting British goods, non-importation. The colonists are going to agree to boycott British goods. And remember, the British, they have all the manufactured goods, right? From the Industrial Revolution. And for them to make all these goods, and obviously they're going to sell them at a higher price to catch up for the debt caused by the French and Indian War and the 7 Years' War in Europe. It's going to hurt their economy. Not economy. It's going to hurt the pockets of the merchants and shipping companies, because they're expecting to receive a payment, and when their goods are not being bought, it's not good for their pockets. So that's going to also lead to a growth of American homespun movement. If you remember the putting out system from the Industrial Revolution last year, textile, at-home textile industry, just think of that. In 1770, all Townshend duties were repealed except for the tea. And that's going to lead to, later on, the Boston Massacre, where March 5th, 1770, a conflict arose between colonists and redcoats. And, the beginnings of this aren't really known, why the colonists were against the redcoats, but as we know, they were throwing some snowballs. Some snowballs, can be hidden with rocks or other sharp objects or even urine. I don't think they're that creative. But, so 5 colonists were killed, and that is famously shown by Paul Revere in his engraving. And leads to our man named Samuel Adams, who was a lead revolutionary, and he proposed the Committees of Correspondence in 1772 so that they could correspond with the British and have nice niceties with the British, if that's a word. Nice relations. Okay, Boston Massacre. I don't know if you can see this. It says the Bloody Massacre, remember? Kind of propaganda-ish. And this is our boy Sam Adams. Ooh. Sorry about it. This is kind of important. It's important. It's very important. Yes, you got this last year taking notes in world history, but this is the cause, right? The tax issue. Americans believe they should only be taxed with their consent. And that's going to lead to that quote, no taxation without representation. All right. And if there is no representative of the colonial governments in Parliament, therefore, Britain should not tax the colonists. And England believed that in this thing called virtual representation, not like 2020 virtual representation. We're talking because Parliament has this idea that they pass legislation, pass taxes to benefit the entire British Empire. They themselves are everyone's being virtually represented in the passage of these laws. and acts and taxes, and that's the British side of things. We all know how that ends up. So you have the tea issue. Again, tea, the British love their tea. And you have the British East India Company, which was on the verge of bankruptcy. So you have the Tea Act of 1773, which it lowered the cost of tea in the colonies, but it was designed to bail out the British East India Company by keeping the prices low, thus, them still gaining enough profit to, kind of pay off that debt. But again, because the colonists were so against the British taxes, it didn't matter that the cost of tea was low. The fact of the matter is that they're passing legislation that is against what the colonists are trying to believe. We don't have representation in Parliament, so stop passing acts, stop passing laws, stop passing taxes to take our money because you were so bad with yours. So you have tax on tea, no taxation without representation. All right, so more. So the Boston Tea Party happens December 16th, 1773. And that was in response, Britain passed the Intolerable Acts, or the Coercive Acts, also known as the Intolerable Acts. And that means that, the Boston Tea Party, the colonists dress up as Native Americans, sneak upon ships that just brought in tea from the British East India Company, and they pour tea into the Boston Harbor. So Tolerable Acts closed the port of Boston until damages were paid. And then you have this extra territoriality. Woo, say that 5 times fast. For British officers accused of crimes. So if you think of, I think that kind of stems from the word of extradition. But British officers accused of committing crimes against the colonists were not going to be held in a trial, would not be held in the colonial governments. They would be taken back to England to be put on trial for their crimes in an English jury, and probably just, receive a slap on the wrist or pay a fine because they'd be favorable to the British. They are British. And that's going to reduce colonial government power because now they can't really, punish the British for punishing the colonists. And then you have the Quebec Act, which extended boundaries in Quebec, and that's going to guarantee rights, political rights to Roman Catholics. Remember, Quebec is in Canada, Canada A. So here you have the extension of it. So the colonists are going to feel like this is an encroachment on them. And this is the new, this orange line is the new, orange or red, whatever you want to call it, the new outline of Quebec. And the colonists are going to feel that's an encroachment on their territory because this is the Northwest Territory right here that is given to Catholics. And remember, Catholics do not go well with the Protestants of England and the British colonies, and so they don't want Catholics over here. So, So the Intolerable Acts are going to help lead to the First Continental Congress, where colonial representatives are going to meet in Philadelphia, Philly, except for Georgia. All other colonial representatives from each colony were present. They created a list of grievances. This first colonial Congress created a list of grievances, and they wanted to repeal most acts in 1763, and they wanted to go back to the days, the good old days since 1763, where, salutary neglect was a big thing. let us run our own country and you don't have to interfere. And they also called for military preparations in case the British do come a-knocking. And they all agreed that this non-importation, non-consumption of all trade with Britain, keep the boycott going strong. And they would meet again in a year, called the Second Continental Congress. And it's very important to note, 1773, 1774, 1775, and even a little bit between in the early parts of 1776, colonists did not want independence. They just wanted to go back. They wanted to go back before all the taxes. All right. But when you think about it now, hindsight, the only way that Britain was going to remain solvent and be happy is if they, got their money for the war. Because as we learned last year, wars cost money, right? So here's the picture of the First Continental Congress. All right, cooperation in war. And so there are going to be some skirmishes, as we learned last year, kind of the Revolutionary War for Independence, right? The battles at Lexington and Concord. The British sought to arrest Samuel Adams and John Hancock. And that's where Paul Revere and his lesser-known accomplice partner, William Dawes, warned the British, one if by land, two if by sea. They were called Minutemen. And in this battle, 8 Minutemen were killed in the fighting. And then they moved on to Concord, where the British knew or heard of ammunitions being held there. Most of the colonists got to remove most of it, but the British still burned some. And then Americans will push the British back to Boston using guerrilla warfare, because as we learned, the American colonists had knowledge of their terrain, knowledge of their geography, more so than the British soldiers coming off a boat. So here you have Lexington and Concord fighting, and that's our boy Paul Revere holding a teapot, I believe. And there you go. So yes, that concludes our lecture. Kind of shorter, but this kind of leads to the beginnings of the American Revolution. America becoming a country of its own, or the ideas of this bond between all the colonies coming together. So hopefully you guys did enjoy that. If you did, smash that like button. And as always, stay safe, wash your hands. Peace.